Cars dominate American life. The daily commutes, road trips, errands, families ferrying the kids around.
This is a good point. Cars are such a fundamental aspect of the American society and like the American dream. I feel like house, white picket fence, dog, family, car is part of that picture. In cars, I'm not entirely sure which aspect they're going to cover here, but I know for myself, I think some of the things that are interesting about this shift is that it went from this idealized version that kind of means that you've made it to it's something that you need as part of your daily life. And this can actually set a lot of people back, especially with some predatory loans, things like that. And also how not a lot of areas in America actually have a lot of good public transportation or easy ways of traveling without a car. And so it's almost something that is necessary, even if you haven't achieved those other aspects of the American dream. But it could actually be holding you back from achieving those other aspects that you're looking forward to, like a house or even starting a family, if you don't have the financial means to do so. So I'm curious what they'll actually cover here, since there's so many things that go into this, the freedom that you get on the positive side and some of those negative aspects that like it financially can hold you back. So we'll see what they have to cover.
You name it.
Wow, look at this. Wow, this is tough.
On the more than 4 million miles of road across the United States, 70% of Americans drive themselves to work. Only 3.5% take public transportation. The common explanation.
So that is actually lower than I thought. So they just said 3.5%. That's such a small number compared to the 70 they just stated for people 70 plus that drive themselves to work. 3.5 is like an abysmally small number. I've never seen it written out like this before, but I knew it was small just because there's very few areas you can actually get public transit. It's usually only in the biggest metropolitan areas. Not every location has any serious public transportation. Some cities that are even quite large in America, like even mid-sized cities, they might just have bus systems, and they obviously aren't throughout that metro area. It might just be in some of the key areas like downtown, for instance. So this is such a almost shamefully small number in my mind. I feel like we should be so far ahead of this, in my opinion, and I think it's a real disservice to the American citizens.
Public transportation. The common explanation is this all happened because Americans just love cars and driving. The open road.
There it is.
Almost too good to believe.
My careful study of this history over a couple of decades now persuades me that the historical record shows that car domination was not the popular preference, was not voted for through democratic processes. It wasn't even the result, as a lot of people will try to claim, of free enterprise just doing its thing.
So it is economical, but I don't care. I don't drive a car to save gasoline. I drive for fun.
Policy has been a driver of shifting what's convenient away from public transit and walking on the one hand to driving on the other.
That has downsides. It's expensive, dangerous, and, say critics, makes cities a lot less livable. There are, of course, some health costs as well. But some attempts to push back on car dominance, such as congestion pricing, transit funding, bike lanes, or pushes for walkable cities, have stoked controversy. CNBC talked with some scholars and looked at numbers to see how America really got so hooked on cars. There are about 283 million registered vehicles for a US population of about 341 million. That means more than 80% of Americans could technically own a car.
Wow, that's such a high number. Another number that I think stands out to me, so basically in this scenario, this is basically meaning basically 0.8 cars per person in America. I think Amsterdam is where I think they have maybe 1.3 bicycles per person, which is just almost insane to me to try to wrap my head around it as an American, just because there's so few people who use alternative modes of transportation, and here we pretty much have as many cars as some countries have bicycles, which is just insane to think about, just considering the size and the upkeep and the expense and all the infrastructure you would need to be able to support that, and how that infrastructure differs compared to these other countries.
This graph right here shows urban mobility in Europe versus the US. Depending on the city, you can see how the population is moving around by public transport, walking, skating or cycling, or driving. In Europe, there's a pretty fair balance between those who are active, take public transport, and drive. On average, about 30 to 50% drive, and the rest is divided between active commuting and public transport, but definitely leaning towards active. In North America, on the other hand, it is generally 70 to 90% by car. Through the years, Americans have mythologized or romanticized the open road, but many roads in the US often actually look a lot more like this. On average, the time Americans spend in traffic is equal to an extra full week of work per year. That's not commuting time, that's just time lost to congestion. In cities like New York and Chicago, it's more than twice that. It's also not cheap to own a car. Insurance premiums, repair costs, and vehicle prices are all near all-time highs. In 2024, Americans, on average, spent more than $12,000 to own and operate a new car. While cars are in many ways safer than they have ever been, they still can and do injure and kill people. Vehicle fatalities started rising again in the 2010s after years of declines. The federal government has called it a national crisis. Those numbers have since fallen a bit, but are still relatively high. Between 2010 and 2023, pedestrian deaths skyrocketed too.
The USA has the worst traffic safety record of any high-income country in the world, and also, almost uniquely among high-income countries, the trends have not been improving over the last 10 to 20 years.
America is hardly alone. Evidence suggests going car crazy is in part a byproduct of prosperity. It's not a perfect comparison, but nearly all American households have access to a car, while only about 55% of Americans have access to public transit. When Americans think of charmingly dense cities with walkable streets, a robust bicycling culture, and great public transit, they often think of Europe.
And of course, all those things are true, but there has been a change. Everybody went crazy for the car once their country got rich enough. And in that sense, we have good company.
There is an important difference, though.
Around the turn of the century, a lot of European countries built out their public transit networks a lot more aggressively and started doing things like implementing congestion pricing, which of course has just been rolled out in one city in the US.
A frequently cited reason for this major distinction is the vast size of the United States and the relatively low density of a lot of American communities. The US is more than double the size of the EU in landmass, even without Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories, but the EU has about 100 million more people.
I've never owned a car in New York City where I used to live, but I've also never taken the subway in Iowa. There is no subway in Iowa. Population density doesn't support it. It just doesn't make sense.
But even comparing a highly populated American city with a European one, like New York versus London and Paris, the numbers are vastly different.
In the early 1900s,
Many American cities were built around public transit and walking, but later became car-centric. There were multiple reasons for this, but a big one was policies favoring cars. These policies were supported by an alliance of different kinds of automotive groups: car clubs, car dealers, manufacturers, sometimes even taxicab and local delivery companies. The list goes on. That group called itself Motordom.
One of the conclusions they reached is that cities like Boston and Chicago and so on were cities where you didn't need a car. And within Motordom, they said this is a bad thing because people aren't buying cars even though they could afford them. They had a term for this. They called it submerged demand. To them, a great way to deal with submerged demand was to promote a road building policy that they were already behind for reasons of moving and selling cars, but that would also promote suburbanization.
In the early 20th century, cars were far more strictly regulated than they are today, but soon the legal regime flipped in their favor.
At first, this strategy was largely directed at the urban fringe where suburbanization was most possible. But by the 1950s, it was also invading the city itself in an attempt, unfathomably destructive attempt, to make old, dense cities places where you could drive and where you could.
Yeah, this is an unfortunate aspect of some of the major cities like New York. it is so terrible to drive there that I think they should just basically prevent it from happening. They should increase the ability to basically get towards maybe the outskirts of New York and then have some very convenient ways to get around there. I think this is something we definitely haven't solved yet. They even highlighted earlier that about 55% of Americans actually have some access to public transportation. And so again, this is where it's unclear how they defined that rule, because there's probably a certain radius a individual has to live to a public transportation center. And so that could mean like they are on the edge of a bus route potentially, and that bus route doesn't take them to anything that they need to go to, is a possibility. And so this is where there might be a larger percentage of Americans than what I anticipate, especially considering they said only like 3.5% of Americans actually like use public transportation to get around most of the time. And so clearly those systems aren't particularly functional for these individuals. And so this is something I wish they worked on. Also, having more pedestrian only areas in the US would be great. I think even in major cities, there's maybe like a couple streets here or there that are like this, but certainly not large areas. I don't think you can go a couple blocks without having cars unless it's for an event or some type of sectioning off for a particular season or a couple days a week or something like that. So it is really hard to get around being an American in other cities. And so most of the time you just have to use a car, or if you use a car for like 90% of your activities and you theoretically could use a bus, it's also very inconvenient to then keep track of the bus schedule and then also keep track of like all of the traffic and routing for your vehicle. And it's so much more convenient. If you already have a car because it needs to satisfy 80-90% of your needs, then it's right next door. It's right outside your house. You can just go get it and go at any time. You don't have to wait for scheduling or a particular route on public transportation.
You could own a car and keep a car.
A self-reinforcing cycle took shape. Investments in cars, such as road building projects, led to further investments in cars.
We often hear the Interstate Highway System and the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which is the basis of it, are often sort of taken as the starting point of modern American car dependency. I think that is much too late of a dating. In fact, one of the things that made it possible to have this enormous public works project was that by 1956, Motordom had already won most of the necessary victories over things like engineering standards, traffic codes, safety education, and so on. And once they'd won those battles, the Interstate Highway Project actually seemed like a natural next step almost.
A 1977 U.S. Supreme Court decision called driving a virtual necessity because long before then, it had become one.
This is perfectly understandable. I'm not even faulting them because this is just good business.
In 2024 alone, the automotive sector spent about $64 million lobbying in the U.S., second only to the air travel industry. There is still a legal regime in place that intentionally or otherwise favors cars and makes it hard to build communities around other forms of transportation. Schill says we subsidize cars, trucks, and SUVs in two main ways: legally and fiscally. Two examples of legal subsidies: land use restrictions and traffic laws. First, land use. There are a number of laws around how people are allowed to use land. For example, nearly all American cities require buildings or structures to have some kind of attached parking. That is changing, but it's still really common.
It's just crazy to me that, big dense cities are requiring huge amounts of parking.
Some laws may not intend to promote driving, but they effectively do. Many communities around the country have zoning laws that restrict home building to single-family dwellings rather than more dense structures like duplexes or apartments. Many of these laws came into effect during the automobile age. Large shares of the buildings already standing in some of America's cities would be illegal to build today. These laws really require communities to spread out, which makes them difficult to comfortably traverse on foot. Lower density also makes it tougher to justify public transit. Traffic laws also favor cars. Speeding is a major contributor to motor vehicle deaths, as much as drunk driving even, but Schill writes that they are under-enforced and are enforced arbitrarily, among other things. Jaywalking laws only exist because of cars. Secondly are the fiscal subsidies. Critics call public transit systems socialist, but various federal and state governments spend billions on road construction and maintenance. About $266 billion on highways alone in 2022, according to one paper.
It takes enormous state capacities, public taxpayer dollars, what some people might call socialistic government departments to make it work. To the extent that it does work, it doesn't actually produce a very efficient result. Americans spend a lot of time sitting in behind the wheel of their car stuck in traffic.
Of course, none of this means we drive solely because of some grand conspiracy by the automotive industry.
I do think it's important to underscore just how awesome cars are, right? Like, people were buying them. Car ownership doubled and tripled every 10 years for a couple decades. If cars sucked, that wouldn't have happened. Now, are there negative externalities of that? Of course. Have we managed those effectively? Of course not.
There also was the allure of cheaper and often higher quality housing out in the suburbs.
When you look at America,
Yeah, that's another great point that they just brought up, which is the cheaper housing in suburbs. I feel like this is something that you still observe in America in smaller cities today. I think something that stands out to me is I want to say Texas, a place that I visited a while ago. It was a place that I had somewhat paid attention to because it was a tech hub that was really starting to form for some time. And especially around COVID, I feel like a lot of folks were moving there because of the weather and also because a lot of other big companies were starting to move there as well. And so it just really took off somewhat recently. But I believe a few years before that, traffic wasn't as bad of a problem. And I think this is true when you look on community forums and things like that, and people discuss their area, where before everybody moved in, it was all car centric and it was pretty easy to move around. And you could have a very cheap home because you could be 5-10 miles away from the city center. And, it would take you 10-15 minutes to get down to the city center in a car. But then as more and more folks moved in and as that density increased, then traffic really started to take over. And it made you almost feel like you're farther and farther away from that city center. But it's so alluring to go to one of these city centers today or other small areas. I feel like I see this all the time where individuals see that they're sort of priced out of the metropolitan areas that they want to live in. So you look to the suburbs or even to smaller cities where it'll be cheaper. And you could just have a car and then you just drive. There's not that many people around, and that's why the housing is cheaper, is because there's less demand. And so you can actually see this trend still occur where smaller cities, as they get more population dense, they start to increase traffic, and then they start thinking about public transportation. And so this phenomenon is still occurring in a variety of areas today.
The suburbs.
when you look at America today, where you see high transit ridership, New York, San Francisco, Boston, you have sort of lower income people who use transit and then very high income people who use transit. There's sort of like a bimodal split. And so if you think about Manhattan, all the fanciest, richest neighborhoods have subways. You can see how if you're really in that middle class, you can't afford that. And then maybe you don't want to live far out on the subway in Queens or Brooklyn or the Bronx or whatever. So then what's left for you, right? You have suburban America.
So while cars did benefit from policy support, people also liked and could afford to live in places where cars were essentially necessary.
American cities in 1900 were not pleasant places. So one can understand the desire to suburbanize and move out. I think context today is very different.
Cars won't vanish from U.S. roads anytime soon.
I would expect the use of cars to intensify.
Over the last 10 to 15 years, especially since the pandemic, a growing share of Americans have chosen suburbs and exurbs over cities.
Where you really need a car for daily life. There's really no indication that as an overall trend that is reversing. I think in this country, taking steps to push people away from cars is doomed to fail and is undesirable as a matter of individual liberty.
For those jobs where driving makes the most sense, we should permit driving, although we may have to charge people for the public costs of accommodating that driving, like for the road. But wherever anything else works, we want to accommodate that.
A slice of the population would prefer to live in smaller apartments and denser places if it means taking fewer car trips, walking and biking more, and taking public transit or cabs and rideshare. A lot of Americans say they like walking and biking more than driving, and some polls in the past have suggested a majority supports more money for public transit.
I think overall we'll see more reliance on cars, but I do think we'll see growth of this additional option that has been, to some extent, suppressed by legal constraints, by law.
A plethora of cities.
I agree. I think alternative modes of transportation in the US, other than cars, are going to become more prevalent. I've seen a lot more bike lanes out and about my metropolitan area, and this is something like I never saw like 10 years ago. Like you would never see a bike lane in America, which is a shame in and of itself. But it's good that we're starting to see them, and they're starting to be seen in like farther and farther locations from the main downtown area. And so I think this is increasing. Also, I've seen more expansion of railways throughout various portions of the US, even some areas that are looking to add railways where they didn't exist previously. And I've heard of some faster transit options that they're looking to have, like New York to Washington, for instance, or, like LA to San Francisco or other various locations in California. And so they're looking at ways to connect sort of more distant metropolitan areas that do have some public transportation, and even those are starting to branch out a bit more. So I do think it's going to increase, and especially since most population is towards these metropolitan areas in the US, that they're going to have a disproportionate amount of people, and the density is going to aggregate there. And so I think it is going to be a positive feedback loop where if you live in one of these cities like Texas, as I referenced earlier, it's going to become untenable to actually drive. And so people are going to feel that pain for a while, and they might even be resistant to public transportation because they're so used to their cars. But at some point, it's just going to become so painful that they're just going to say, yes, give me some public transportation, even if they're fighting it. And then they're going to lean in more and more, because when your only option is to sit in traffic for hours and hours, you'd basically take any other alternative to it. And so I think this is a scenario where it's so convenient to have a car that there's no reason to think about alternatives. But then when you're trapped and you're stuck having to use a car in a location that really doesn't support it, then that's where you really look to seek out these other alternatives.
Around the country have rolled back their parking requirements and loosened zoning laws.
We want to promote walkability. We want to permit cycling. We want to take advantage of the fact that now, thanks to electric bikes, cycling is something that is more practical on more topographies for a much broader range of people, if we would only accommodate that very low intensity demand that's much more affordable to accommodate than driving.
Some measures may prove more popular than they seem at first. New York enacted a congestion pricing plan in January 2025 to reduce traffic in the city, but it came after some intense legal battles.
In the literature, among people who study cities, there's this debate over whether policy should try to push people away from cars with a stick or whether it's better to use carrots. And I think this is kind of a false dichotomy, and congestion pricing shows that, right? On the surface, it's a stick. If you're driving during peak hours into the congestion zone, you have to pay the fee. But it's also a carrot because you can drive much more easily and quickly for that price. And as a consequence, that creates a stream of revenue that can be used to strengthen public transit.
But strengthening the case for other transit options, especially investments in public transit, requires making them cost-effective. NYU's Transit Costs Project has shown that the US pays a lot more for public transportation than many peer countries. The first phase of the 2nd Avenue subway in New York City cost 10 times the amount of comparable systems in Italy, Sweden, and Turkey.
People can interpret some of our work as being anti-transit. It's not the case, of course. But what you see in the US is just very little output for time and money.
The US could reduce costs several ways, such as by adopting practices from low-cost countries, standardizing designs for stations, not overbuilding, and holding agencies accountable for budgets. But public transit also has to compete in terms of time. It takes about twice as long as it does to travel by car. That also doesn't have to be the case. Caltrain, a commuter rail line in the San Francisco Bay Area, electrified its trains, which sped up trips. The group also doubled the frequency of service.
That oftentimes puts you in, striking distance of driving. And then it's like, okay, I get those 10 minutes back. That's awesome. I'll take it.
Ridership jumped 17% overall and 38% on weekends in its first month of service.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I will see you around.